Good morning. Or buenos dias. Thank you, Robert. I was telling Rachel last night as we were coming back in and going through customs and all that it's always funny to me, and I guess a little bit embarrassing, because when you come in from one of those trips where you, especially one of these smaller trips where nobody's translating the services, nobody's, the only thing translating is our English into Spanish. And so there's a lot of Spanish being spoken, and sometimes you just do the best you can. If I told Rachel one time, I said, Hainer has a trial by fire method of teaching you Spanish sometimes, where he will just get up and walk away and leave you there to speak with someone and to do the best that you can. But anyway, would you get in a situation like that where you're speaking more, or at least attempting to speak more of the language, you come back into the country and you start talking to people, and I mean, there's certain phrases and things that people can, replies that people can, you don't have to know much Spanish at all. And somebody says something and you can say sí or no, and gracias and things like that. And sometimes, you get back and you're speaking to someone who is clearly an English-speaking person. You may just stop at a service station and they say, will that be all? Sí. And they kind of look at you like, what? So it's that always sort of makes me chuckle, and a little bit embarrassing at times when you come back after a trip like that. So we are in, I'll have more to say about that, about the overall trip later on, but it's good to be home. And it just feels like I'm torn in two sometimes, because I was telling Robert this morning, when you go somewhere and you get to work with people more than once, 2, 3 times or more, and you get to know the people, you get to know some of their struggles, that really becomes even more difficult to leave. And I sort of tease the people down there. And I've told them that I've mentioned it here, and I have mentioned it before, that if I didn't leave some of my family here, I might just not go back. And so I said, the Bremen people make me leave somebody at home in my family so that they know I'll come back. If I ever take the whole family down there with me, I might just not ever come back. It's just such a good work and a good. I don't know. I just really have. Connected with those people and love and appreciate them. And of course, Hainer, just such a great young man. And well, I keep saying young man, he's now past 30, but that's still young, right? It's amazing how that perspective changes, isn't it? A few years ago, I'd have said, well, it's not so young, but yeah, it's a young man. But he's such a good young man and faithful preacher, very, very sharp biblically as well. And I think just being able to work with him as well is such a great privilege for me. I ain't even going to fake it today. I brought my cafe because necesito café esta mañana. But we are in John chapter 7. The next question in our list, we're studying questions Jesus asked. And I appreciate Levi. He has done a tremendous job filling in. I was so grateful that Leroy was up for. In fact, we'd kind of arranged for Levi to fill in, and even as recent as maybe a year or so ago, I'd ask him something about speaking at Bremen, and he would say no, and I'd say, "Bro, you're preaching like every other week at Heflin." And he says, "Yeah, I'm preaching to like 20 people." And so I said, well, what's the big deal? And he's like, well, a lot more people at Bremen, and that's home. He's like, that's different. And I didn't argue with him too much on that, maybe a little bit, but because I remember even starting out as somebody who, I'm going to preach. That is the hardest place to preach, is home. It still is for me. Your home congregation, even years down the road, it's just, I don't know. So when I knew Johnny was going to be out of town, and so I was looking, and Joyce had mentioned to me, I was texting back and forth with Joyce, this is several weeks for my trip, and she says, well, what about Levi? I said, well, I tell you what, I'll ask him, but I know what he's going to say. Well, I guess I didn't know, because he said yes, and I was, okay, are you all right? But he said he could cover class Sunday morning, Sunday evening. I was like, all right, I think we're good to go. And but then I don't know, about a week or two before I left, Leroy had reached out to me and said, hey, I think I'm up for an evening lesson if you need me sometime, but not sure about Sunday morning. And so I asked Levi, I said, well, look, I know I've already got you set, but what do you think about that? I said, what do you think about? I said, here's the thing, you may have to be on standby. And so are you okay with having a lesson that you may or may not present? He said, no, that's fine. And so, and with the time difference, it worked out where Sunday morning, as we're getting ready to leave, I got to see Levi teaching here in the auditorium. And then as we drove to pick up a member of the church there, and then drive to the church services at La Fortuna, we got to hear Levi preaching in the morning worship hour. And then coming home, we had to take that brother back home. Hayner stopped at his apartment. He was going to drop us off, and I said, well, I'll ride with you. We left Rachel there where she could go ahead and do some homework or something, because it's about a 45-minute or so round trip to go drop him off and pick him up. But right about the time we were dropping her off and letting her in the apartment, time we get back in the car, evening worship was starting here. So I got to hear Leroy preach. And then Wednesday night, they don't have a Wednesday night Bible study, so we were able to pull up and watch the live stream of the Wednesday night service. And Hayner saw, as soon as Levi finished teaching Wednesday night, Chris came up here and was speaking to him, and Hayner looked at me and he said, I bet he's offering him a job. So he did a fine job, and I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful to that Leroy got to preach. I'm thankful I got to hear Leroy preach. And so it was just a good trip all around. Now, again, John chapter 7, we're looking at questions Jesus asked. Levi said last week, I told him, I said, I heard you throw me under the bus. He said, I figured y'all might want to have a little break from questions Jesus asked. But in John chapter 7, Jesus here, he's going to ask this question, why do you seek to kill me? And we looked at all this context 2 weeks ago, and so I won't re-teach all of that. But it's in this context, and some of this still is looking back to chapter 5 when he healed this man on the Sabbath day, and they somehow, in their twisted understanding, twisted traditions pertaining to the Sabbath, are insisting he has broken the Sabbath by healing a man on the Sabbath day. Now, he didn't. In fact, it's Matthew 12:12, I think. Yes, 12:12, where Jesus makes the point, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath day. But they've just got it in their minds. He has broken the Sabbath, and that's probably the source of some of the, we talked 2 weeks ago about some of the debate going on here in John 7. Some of the people saying, oh, he's the prophet, or he's from God, and other people saying, what is it, verse 12, some said he's a good man, others who are saying, oh no, he's deceiving the people. Some of that probably is stemming from, the Pharisees, they say he broke the Sabbath law. How could he be a good man? How could he be this teacher from God if he's breaking the Sabbath? If he doesn't even keep and honor the Sabbath? And maybe there's somebody else in that little group, and they say, well, maybe it's what my grandpa says or my dad says, or maybe even I studied the Torah, and I remember from synagogue classes that it's not wrong to do something good on the Sabbath day. who said he actually broke the Sabbath? Just because they said that, that doesn't necessarily, so you kind of hear the debates going on. So he asked them the question that we looked at 2 weeks ago, 2 questions there in verse 19. So the people, they say, well, you got a demon. Who's going about to kill you? Verse 20, and Jesus says, look, I've done one work, and ye all marvel. Of course, he did many works, but he said this one work. It's almost like he's saying, I don't know if I can say this with certainty, but perhaps at least he's saying, kind of to paraphrase it how we might say it, y'all are hung up over this one thing. Y'all are just, you just can't seem to get around this one work. And of course, that's part of what the miracles were for. That's the main purpose of the miracles, was to confirm the word, to confirm the authority of the message. And sometimes it was to confirm the authority of the message over and above their traditions that they tried to put up here on a par with the Word of God. But Jesus would say, they're not. And I can show you, I can back this up with evidence in the form of works, miracles. So he says, I've done one work, and ye all marvel. Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers. This is there in verse 22. And ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. Well, if the 8th day, of course, the law of Moses called for a person to be circumcised on the 8th day, a boy to be circumcised on the 8th day. If that fell on a Sabbath day, they didn't say, well, it's the Sabbath, we can't do it. Well, what are you going to do? It's a Sabbath day. Well, they did. They circumcised that little boy. So he says, Moses gave you that law, and you do that on the Sabbath day. Now, here's our question in verse 23. If a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry at me because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? And then it's in that context he says, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. There's a little bit of a, not a little bit, there's a stark contrast that he's making here. He says, okay, the 8th day falls on a Saturday, Sabbath, 7th day of the week. You circumcise that boy. I have healed a man on the Sabbath. Do you see the difference? One involves, it's a surgical procedure. It's cutting, it's painful, and he says, you do that on the Sabbath? If that falls on the 8th day, after this child's born, you start circumcise him. By contrast, Jesus says, I have made a man 100% well on the Sabbath. And you're upset about it. That just doesn't seem to make sense, does it? And so that's what Jesus is asking him here. He's kind of, again, to paraphrase it how we might say it, he's sort of saying, hey, fellas, let's think about this for a minute. Let's just think about how unreasonable you're being and how illogical you're being. He'd already talked to him before about how if you have an animal on the Sabbath, you can lead him to water. You could feed him. If he falls into a ditch, you talk about work. You got an animal that falls into a ditch and needs help getting out, that's work. But he says you can do that on the Sabbath, but you can't heal a man. That somehow is a violation of the Sabbath? Well, Jesus is trying to get them to see how ridiculous they're being. And so he says, if a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry at me because I've made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? So that's Jesus' point here. He's speaking to these Jews that are upset about this, and of course just the Jews generally that are accusing him of breaking the Sabbath. And this is one of the main, I've mentioned this several times, one of the main points of contention that the Jews will have, the Jewish leaders will have with Jesus is about the Sabbath day. But Jesus, again, has already declared it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. They thought it okay to circumcise on the Sabbath, activity that involved the physical body. Jesus has performed a miracle that involves a blessing to the physical body. It just doesn't add up. And of course, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. And make no mistake, as Lord of the Sabbath, it doesn't mean when Jesus says that, Mark chapter 2, verse 28, the Lord of the Sabbath, he's not saying there, I have the right to violate the Sabbath because I'm Lord of the Sabbath. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying there is, as Lord of the Sabbath, of course, Jesus, he didn't say he had the right to violate it because he obeyed the law of Moses perfectly. He lived and died under the law of Moses. What he is saying, though, as Lord of the Sabbath, he has the right to determine what is and is not acceptable according to Sabbath law, right? That would be determined by the Lord of that law. And so he says, he's Lord of the Sabbath, and he was. And that's the context of verse 24 when he says, judge not according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. You know, it's almost like he's saying, you know, okay, maybe on the surface somebody says, oh yeah, that's he's doing work on the Sabbath day. He says, don't judge just on that cursory appearance. He says, you determine the facts. There's a proverb, I can't think of the reference. He that is first in his cause seems just, but then his neighbor comes and searches him. In other words, the first person that comes along and points at Jesus' action and says, oh, look, he's violating the Sabbath. And somebody may say, oh, well, yeah, I don't know about this. Maybe he's not a teacher come from God. But then the neighbor comes along and says, hey, guys, let's stop and think about this. Is it really a violation of Sabbath if he is, as he claims to be God in the flesh? Number one, is it really work for an omnipotent being to heal someone that he created? No. Number two, guys, let's think about it. Sabbath law was given to us for us to have rest, not just to completely handicap us and make us sit at home and, you know, do nothing all day long. It was given as a day of rest because God knew we needed that. So there's also the fact that, you know, when a child is born and the 8th day falls on the Sabbath, we still circumcise that child because we understand that's not the point of God's law. He wants us to keep that, to honor that teaching. Well, there's also the fact that, you know, animals, we lead them to water. If they fall into a ditch or something, we get them out. So there's all this to consider. And when the neighbor comes along and searches him, just like, oh, yeah, there's no Sabbath violation here. This is nothing going on here that's wrong at all. And so it's like Jesus is trying to reason with them. Are they going to listen to the truth? Are they going to accept the truth? And of course, same thing with us. It may not be pertaining to this particular matter, but are we going to listen to the truth? Are we going to accept the truth? And so Jesus is trying to get them to understand they're so worked up over this healing on the Sabbath thing, and they're just not thinking straight about it. And of course, we know now in hindsight, they're not going to listen to the truth. They're not going to accept the truth. Some of them will, but most of the religious leaders, at least, they're not. And so they go on and they say, well, is this not the one they're seeking to kill? Now, you know, earlier they had said, oh, no, nobody's, you've got a demon. Who's seeking to kill you? Well, they understood somebody's wanting to kill him. And look, he's speaking boldly, and they say nothing to him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is the very Christ? Then somebody says, howbeit we know this man whence he is. In other words, we know where Jesus is from, but when Christ cometh, no man knoweth whence he is. Well, I don't know where they got that because the Old Testament talked about where the Christ would come from. He was born in Bethlehem and so on. There are a lot of prophecies dealing with that, but Jesus goes on and he continues to teach here in chapter 7. He cried in the temple as he taught. I want to drop down for our next question, there's more context there, but I'll leave that for you to study on your own time. He speaks to him on the, I think it's the last day of the feast. Where does it say that? Yeah, 37, he stood up on the last day of the feast. We've talked before about that background where it was, the Jews say on the last day of this feast they would pour out some water. And Jesus, mentions here, if any man thirst, let him come unto me. There was like this ceremonial, ritual, probably be the right term for it, where a priest would stand up and pour out water. I'm trying to remember the symbolism of that. It might have been something to do with God bringing water out of the rock or something. I can't remember it. It's been a little while since I've studied that in depth. But it's interesting because it's that in that context that Jesus says, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. And, who knows? Jesus might have said that like as the priest poured out the water on that symbolic act, that ritual, and this being the last day of the feast. And then Jesus stands there. We're not told the timing, so it could be, maybe not, I don't know. And he says, if any man shall seek, if any man shall thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He that believes on me, as the scripture has said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. And so, wow, that's something to think about. And it probably, whether it happened right after that or what some other time during that last day of the feast, it would have probably just incensed some of those Jewish leaders because it would take attention away from what they were doing. They loved their pomp and ceremony, pouring out the water, and then Jesus says, if anybody's thirsty, let him come to me. So that now the attention comes to Jesus as opposed to these leaders and what they're doing. It's not that Jesus wanted the attention on him, but he realizes he's man's only hope. And he says, you're thirsty. That's not the water you need. This is the water you need. Now, going down, of course, they send some people to basically to take Jesus to arrest him. They come back empty-handed, verse 46, and they say, never man spake like this man. They were just kind of, I guess we could say, enamored. So they didn't come back with him, and oh man, that made the Pharisees angry. Are you also deceived? Verse 47. Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees, any rulers or of the Pharisees, believed on him? Well, so what? I mean, it's like a bunch of immature little middle schoolers that, it's like, oh, here's somebody that people are showing some attention to, and they get jealous. Well, are we friends with him? Is our cool group friends with him? Well, he must not be anything then. I mean, that's what does the rulers or the Pharisees have to do with whether Jesus' message is from heaven or not? Not a thing. And they say, this people who knoweth not the law are cursed. Well, indeed. They don't know the law themselves, or at least they don't follow it. So Nicodemus there speaks up, and that's what I wanted to mention here in this before we move on to the next question. Nicodemus, we talked about him before in chapter 3. Here's Nicodemus, and he at least is honest enough to say, verse 51, does our law judge any man before it hear him and know what he doeth? And that makes them mad. Instead of being honest and saying, well, yeah, you're right. I guess we're jumping to conclusions here or whatever. They say, are you also of Galilee? Search and look, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. Jonah was from that region. I guess they should take their own advice. Search and look. And there were prophecies pertaining to that as well. So every man went unto his own house, verse 53, and that ends chapter 7. Then you get to chapter 8, and of course our next question is in chapter 8, verse 10. This is a section of where the woman is taken in adultery. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again into the temple. All the people came unto him. He sat down and taught them. I'm not going to get into the textual questions about this. Some people question, and you may have a version that footnotes it or has a note there, something that says some manuscripts omit this section. Long story short on that, there's a lot a whole lot that could be said. We did talk about it in our How We Got the Bible class a while back. But the summation of what I have come up with as far as my studies, I don't claim to be any kind of a textual scholar, textual critic scholar, whatever, but from studying others who are, I believe it is 100% genuine. I'm not sure it's at the right spot necessarily. There's some evidence that maybe it might go in a different spot within the book of John. Like it somehow got mixed around, but I think there's ample evidence. I think there's abundant evidence that it is, in fact, a genuine text, despite what some folks would attempt to say about it. If for some reason, if evidence comes to light at some point and shows, well, it's not genuine, well, it wouldn't take any kind of major doctrine out of Scripture or whatever, but I mean, the evidence is there, and I think it's pretty clear that the text is, in fact, genuine. So again, I won't get into all that, but I just want to mention that because sometimes people will be reading a section like this and they go, wait a minute, I got a note in my Bible here, a footnote, and it says some versions omit this. What's going on with that? But it is missing in some manuscripts. But again, I think there's abundant evidence that it is, in fact, the genuine text. So, scribes and Pharisees, verse 3, bring a woman taken in adultery. They set her in the midst. They're upset, and they are righteously indignant. Well, supposedly. If they really were righteously indignant, what tells us here, what's kind of the red flag here that they're not at least righteously indignant? Yeah, they say we got her in the act, caught her in the act. Well, you shouldn't have had any trouble bringing the man either for judgment, for sentencing, but he is conveniently missing. Some scholars have speculated he was in the crowd, perhaps part of this. I don't know. Some people say that like they know it, but there's no possible way to know that for sure from the text. What we do know is they did not present Jesus with, hey, look, here is this couple, this man and woman that we caught in the act. Maybe, and again, the speculation among commentators will run wild sometimes on this. If you don't believe me, just go read a few. Sometimes people will say, oh, they had something against her, and so they set her up, and this was a way to, carry out something against her, and they kind of feel like, well, we can kill two birds with one stone, and we'll get Jesus and catch him in a conundrum here as well. Again, I don't know that. Maybe. Why pick her? Well, they it would seem reasonable to conclude that they had something against her. They had some axe to grind with her for some reason. I don't know. But maybe they just knew that she was somebody that would actually do this. Because did she sin? I mean, they caught her in the very act. She did sin. It may just be that they say, hey, here's somebody we know that will. But it does sort of reek, as we say, of a setup. Be that as it may, we can't say with 100% certainty, and sometimes people do in commentaries and lessons and sermons, but we just don't know. So they say this woman was taken in adultery in the very act, verse 4. Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? What do you say, Jesus? Oh man, don't you know they just feel like they have got him on the horns of a dilemma, because Jesus, he wants to help people. He wants people to live their lives and to be happy and to be free. But he talks about the law. Let's see how he's going to handle this. And again, sometimes some commentators have speculated this was somebody Jesus knew, perhaps had healed before, that this was a disciple of Jesus that they were able to lure into temptation. I don't know, maybe. All that would be, it's not like that'd be hard to believe, right?
Hey, Chad.
Yes, sir.
It's almost like they brought her, and they were testing him to see what he would say. As if he says stoner, then they could consider him a false prophet, and then they would turn around and say, well, the law says we should have this man. But ignoring the sin, but he dealt with the issue of the men and the women when they brought them.
And that's interesting to me too, because again, there's so many different ways that the commentators can run wild with speculation on this. And I don't have a problem with it as long as they acknowledge that, we're speculating. Some of them try to say like this is, and I've seen some that have speculated. I've seen some that have said, oh, well, clearly this didn't really happen. There was not really a case of adultery. Again, that is a speculation. However, I've seen some commentators who have said, and this I 100% agree with, perhaps there's not something that actually happened here. They bring this woman, and who knows, she could be in cahoots with them. And we're going to say we caught her in adultery in the very act. I don't think that that's the most likely scenario, just because when Jesus is going to say, he's going to stoop down right on the ground, and he's going to say, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And they're going to be convicted by their own conscience, verse 9, and they start to walk away from the youngest, or from the oldest even to the youngest. Maybe they're convicted by their own conscience of their own deceit in concocting this scenario. But I don't know, it just seems to me a little more, if there's not some reason to go otherwise, you take the most natural reading of a text. And the most natural reading seems they did catch this lady in adultery. Is it possible that they concocted the whole thing? It certainly is. But, is it possible that they set her up to actually get caught in adultery? Or maybe they just happened upon it, and then they're like, wow, what a fortuitous opportunity. And now we can go get Jesus and put him on the horns of a dilemma and see what he wants to, what he claims to be the master teacher. Let's see what he has to say about this. I don't know. But I think that is a key point there, because they bring him to Jesus and they say, well, here's what the law says. What do you say, Jesus? And so verse 6, this they said, tempting him that they might have to accuse him. And it's interesting because Jesus, he doesn't answer. Very rarely, we've pointed this out numerous times in this study, very rarely does Jesus just answer a question directly. A lot of times he'll answer with a question. Sometimes he answers, as here, with silence. And why would he do that? Maybe he wants them to think. But he stoops down, and with his finger he's writing on the ground. And again, we could go absolutely bonkers with what Jesus wrote on the ground, but we don't know. So I think it was a commentator I read one time that said he wrote the man's name. The man that they didn't bring, he wrote the man's name with his finger on the ground in the dirt. I don't know, maybe he did, but how do you go and just say that? The Bible doesn't tell us. So when they continued asking, in verse 7 says, he lifted up himself, said unto them, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. So here's his answer. Here's one of those occasions where he does, and I suppose you could say he doesn't answer the question in some sense, because he doesn't answer it right away, at least. He pauses, stoops down, he writes on the ground, acts like he doesn't even hear him. You could almost, I bet you could just feel that tension. And it's just, ask anybody who's ever stood before an audience, you pause for a second when people are when eyes are on you and people are expecting you to say something, they're expecting you to continue or answer the question. It might just be in a court proceeding. And here's a lawyer, and they say, okay, well, Mr. Dollahite, such and such. So what about that? Can you answer that question? And everybody's just sort of waiting, and the judge is looking. And again, as a preacher, Bible class teacher, if you've ever done that, a second feels like an eternity. And it's like second, another second, and it's just this super uncomfortable. And you don't have to be that speaker, though, because if you've ever been in the audience when that's happened, maybe the speaker maybe he's brand new, and it's, I've been there with a young man, and he's getting up to speak for the first time, and he is so nervous. And sometimes I'm just like, I feel like I'm as nervous as he is. And I'm on edge, and he fumbles a little bit, stumbles a little bit, and maybe he drops his notes. And I'm just kind of like, I feel like I'm about to have anxiety because I want this guy to do great. And I'm so worried. You just want to run up there and like help him, like, let me get those for you. And every second feels like, so you could just imagine how palpable the tension was as they ask him, well, what do you say, Jesus? What do we do here? And he just says, and he stoops down and starts to just write on the ground. And hey, can you imagine? I mean, some of them maybe, perhaps, likely were, just fuming. Why won't he answer? What is he doing? Why doesn't he just go ahead and answer? Others maybe are like, what? Is he stuck? Does he not know what to say? Why is he not answering? And so you could just, man, I'm telling you, I can only imagine what that must have been like. So he stooped down, wrote on the ground, and then he makes that statement, he that is without sin among you. People love to quote this verse. It's one of those like, judge not that you be not judged. People sometimes will, it's the only verse they seem to know. Oh, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. Well, he's not saying in any matter, before you can rebuke anybody, before you can say anything to anybody about their sin, you've got to be without sin. Obviously, there's a context to that statement. He that is without sin among you in this particular matter, you be the first one to throw a stone. Were they in sin and how they brought this whole scenario about and bringing her to Jesus? Yes, obviously. Might be because of how they concocted it, might be because of how they set her up, might be because just simply the fact that they didn't bring the man. But every single one of them was in sin. They were in the wrong in this matter. And they were all together in on it. Not one of them could say, well, I didn't know what was going on here, and so I'm innocent. No, they all knew what they were doing. This was all, whether concocted, whether a setup, whether they just happened to catch her. They brought her to Jesus without the man for one reason and one reason only, to try to entrap him. And so he says, whichever one of you is without sin in this matter, why don't you just take up the first stone and you can start this stoning. And then he stooped down again and starts writing on the ground. Again, we don't have a clue what he wrote, but he made his statement and he went right back to what he was doing. They which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. There's a lot we could say here about this particular question in this context. Of course, there's another question right here in this same context. But the motive of the accusers is explicitly given to us by inspiration here, verse 6. They're saying this, tempting Jesus so that they can have something to accuse him. How would they have something to accuse him in this matter? Yeah, either way, they feel like they've got him in it's kind of like do we pay taxes or not? If he says, sure, pay your taxes, oh man, the people are upset because it's Roman rule, pagan Roman, and everybody hates paying taxes. If he says, nah, don't pay your taxes, Rome's pagan, and we shouldn't have any part of that, well, then he's sideways with the Roman government. Here they feel like they got him on the horns of a dilemma with the law itself, the law of God. If he says, oh, no, she looks sorry for this, so you should just let her go. Well, now that's a problem because adultery was a capital offense under the law of Moses. But if he says stone her, well, that's what the law says, stone her. What's the problem there? There's really two problems there. Number one problem was Rome. Rome did not allow the Jews to carry out capital punishment. You're going to see that with the crucifixion of Jesus. They're going to take him before Pilate, and Pilate's going to say, just take him and judge him according to your law. Stop bothering me, essentially is what Pilate says. They say, oh, we have a law that he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. It's kind of like, well, that's why we're here, Pilate. We need your go-ahead. But they're also in trouble with the law of Moses or Jesus would be going against the law of Moses if he says, stone her, because they don't have the man there, and what was required in a capital punishment case? The testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So if Jesus says, well, ma'am, I'm sorry, but you did the crime, and now it's a capital punishment, so yes, you have to stone her. They say, oh, we got you. We don't have 2 or 3 witnesses. If he says, let her go, we got you, because here's what the law says. Yes, sir.
When he talks about casting the first stone, the people that were stoning the guilty person, those were the innocent witnesses. Somebody that's not involved in
Yes.
the crime. I could be somebody steal something. They didn't steal it from me. They didn't steal it from my family. Just an innocent bystander witness.
The law called for that. If you were one of those 2 or 3 witnesses, you were the first one. And that was just what the law called for. And so let me go ahead and read down a little bit and get you to our next question in this context, and we'll wrap up here. They which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing in the midst. And Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman. He said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? 2 questions here in verse 10. She said, No man, Lord. Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. So the law called for the 2 or 3 witnesses. They don't have that, so Jesus is not going to say, sure, carry out the sentence. He says, he's essentially asking, it would seem at least by that by that statement, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone. Well, whichever of you are going to be the 2 or 3 witnesses, you can, and as Scott pointed out, the innocent witnesses, but he says there's nobody innocent in this situation, because y'all have brought this situation here as a means to try to entrap me. And he knew that. He knew that good and well, just as well as they did. And so if they were so interested in doing what was right, where's the man? And they're not interested in doing what's right, of course. Let's see. Yes, sir. And that's a good point. Like, yeah, you're so righteously indignant. Number one, you're supposed to be the innocent witness. You cast the first stone, which means, yeah, Rome comes looking, how'd this thing get started? Well, yeah, that's a good point. And so, like, they want no part of that. And so they just kind of, well, and they just sort of. Yeah, they want to be able to say, well, he told us. And so, yeah, he doesn't. I mean, it's just another one of those occasions where you just kind of go, wow, at the wisdom. They feel like they no doubt felt this was unget-overable. We've got him. And he turns it on them again. And it happens so many times. And so the last question, or really kind of 2 questions here, where Jesus asked her in verse 10. Of course, they all leave eventually, one by one, beginning at the oldest even to the last. And Jesus says, where are your accusers? Has no man condemned you? This is the same context, obviously. Jesus says, go and sin no more. Again, it does seem she had committed sin. Some people say, well, okay, how did Jesus violate the law here? Because it was a capital punishment, was a capital crime under the law of Moses. So did she just get away with it? No, he tells her, go and sin no more. But there also, to carry out that punishment under the law, there had to be 2 or 3 witnesses. The only person there at this point who knows what happened was her and 1 witness, Jesus. But the law called for 2 or 3. And he says, I don't condemn you. You go and sin no more. She didn't just get away with it. She was being used. And Jesus is not trying to just excuse her sin, but he says, you go and sin no more. So, but the law did require the 2 or 3 witnesses. So All right, we'll stop there, and Lord willing, pick up next week with we got a few more questions in chapter 8, but I wanted to get through the questions there in that context of 1 through 11. Thank y'all very much. We will take a break, have a short break before our worship period this morning.